Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I've always loved driving at night. There's something calming about the world after dark, when the traffic thins out and the roads become your own personal highway. The stillness of the night, the hum of the engine, the glow of the dashboard, it's my kind of therapy. But there's also an uneasiness that comes with being out there, alone, with only the stars and your headlights to guide you. That's something I learned the hard way. It was late summer, and I had decided to take a back road home from a friend's place in the country. The scenic route, I called it. It was a quiet, winding road that cut through farmland and woods, with no streetlights and barely any signs of life. Just miles of darkness and the occasional farmhouse, their windows glowing softly in the distance. I'd driven this road plenty of times before, but that night, something felt different. I remember checking the clock as I turned onto the back road, 12:30 a.m. The sky was clear, and the moon hung low, casting a pale light over the fields. My windows were down, letting in the cool night air, and I had some soft music playing on the radio. Everything felt peaceful, perfect even. But about 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed something strange. It started as a faint glow on the horizon, just above the tree line. At first I thought it was the moon reflecting off some clouds, but as I got closer, the glow grew brighter, more intense. It wasn't the soft yellow light of a farmhouse or the steady beam of a streetlight. This was different, almost unnatural. Curious, I slowed down, trying to get a better look. The lights were hovering above a field just off the road, flickering in and out like they were dancing in the air. There were 3 of them, all perfectly spaced apart, glowing a pale blue that made my skin crawl. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. I pulled over to the side of the road, turning off my engine and stepping out of the car. The night was silent, the only sound coming from the wind rustling through the cornfields. I stood there for a moment, just watching the lights. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just hung there in the air, pulsing faintly. For a split second, I considered walking toward them, but something in my gut told me to stay put. There was something off about those lights, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I didn't want to get any closer. Just as I was about to get back in the car, the lights started to move. They floated slowly across the field, dipping down toward the ground before rising back up again. It was almost as if they were searching for something, gliding silently over the crops. My heart raced as I watched them, every instinct in my body screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't. I was frozen, mesmerized by the eerie dance of the lights. And then, without warning, they turned. All 3 lights shifted, pointing directly at me. My breath caught in my throat as the lights began to move toward the road, slowly at first, but then faster, like they had suddenly noticed me standing there, watching. I stumbled backward, my hand fumbling for the door handle as panic surged through me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I yanked the car door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut just as the lights reached the edge of the field. I locked the doors out of instinct, my hands shaking as I fumbled to start the engine. The lights were getting closer now, brightening with each passing second. They hovered just above the ground, casting long, unnatural shadows across the road. The engine sputtered to life, and I floored it, speeding down the road as fast as I could. My tires squealed against the asphalt, and I could hear the gravel kicking up behind me. But even as I sped away, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, terrified that the lights were following me. And they were. The 3 glowing orbs floated behind me, matching my speed as I raced down the road. They didn't make a sound, didn't flicker or waver, just kept coming, their eerie blue glow reflecting off the back of my car. My heart was in my throat, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I don't know how long I drove like that, but it felt like an eternity. Every turn I made, every bend in the road, the lights followed. No matter how fast I went, no matter how far I tried to get, they were right there, keeping pace with me. It was like they were toying with me, playing some sick game that I didn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see them still floating behind me, but the road was empty. No lights, no glow, just darkness. My heart was still racing, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I pulled over again, my hands trembling as I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The air was still, the night quiet once more. I stood there for a long time, staring down the road, half expecting the lights to reappear. But they didn't. It was like they had never been there at all. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was a trick of the light, I told myself. Some weird reflection from the moon, or maybe even a drone. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had seen those lights, felt the way they had followed me, and there was nothing natural about it. I got back in the car, my hands still shaking as I started the engine. The rest of the drive was a blur, my mind replaying the scene over and over again. The lights, the way they moved, the way they had seemed to watch me. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. When I finally made it home, I sat in my driveway for a long time, staring out at the darkened street. I hadn't seen another car the entire drive home. No headlights, no taillights, nothing. It was like the road had been deserted, like I had been the only one out there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the lights, glowing faintly in the darkness and following me down that empty road. I tried to shake the feeling, tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the memory of those lights stayed with me, haunting me long after the drive was over. In the days that followed, I did some research, hoping to find some explanation for what I'd seen. Maybe there was a logical reason, ball lightning, or some kind of natural phenomenon. But nothing I found matched what I'd experienced. The lights weren't like anything I'd ever heard of before. I even tried to talk to a few locals, asking if anyone had seen anything strange on that back road. Most people just gave me odd looks, like I was crazy. But one old man, sitting on the porch of a rundown gas station, gave me a knowing smile when I mentioned the lights. "Seen 'em myself a few times," he said, his voice raspy with age. "They come and go. No one knows what they are." "What do they want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The old man shrugged. "Don't know, but they're not looking for trouble, long as you don't go looking for them." That was all he said before turning back to his newspaper, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. I haven't driven that back road since. I stick to the highways now, where the lights are bright and the roads are full of cars. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving down an empty stretch of road, I'll catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror, a faint blue glow, just on the edge of the horizon. And every time, my heart skips a beat, wondering if the lights have found me again. There's something about rest stops at night that gives me the creeps. They're meant to be a place of refuge when you're on a long drive, somewhere you can stretch your legs, grab a snack, and refuel before getting back on the road. But when the sun goes down and the traffic thins out, they take on a whole different atmosphere. Maybe it's the dim lighting, or the way everything feels a little too quiet. But if you've ever stopped at one in the dead of night, you know what I'm talking about. I was on a long drive home after visiting family, and it was getting late. I'd been on the road for hours, and the combination of fatigue and the monotony of the highway was starting to wear me down. My eyes were heavy, and I could feel myself starting to lose focus. I knew I needed a break before I fell asleep at the wheel. That's when I saw the sign for a rest stop coming up in a couple of miles. I didn't think twice about it. I could grab some coffee, maybe walk around a bit, and then get back on the road. Simple enough, right? I pulled into the rest stop just after midnight. It was one of those smaller ones, just a couple of vending machines, a restroom, and a parking lot with a few scattered cars. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. A few trucks were parked at the far end of the lot, their engines humming quietly, but other than that, the place was deserted. I parked near the vending machines, stepped out of my car, and immediately felt the weight of the night settle around me. The air was cooler than I expected, with a slight breeze that rustled the leaves of the nearby trees. There was something about the stillness that made me feel uneasy, but I brushed it off. I was just tired, that's all. I headed for the restroom first, hoping to splash some water on my face to wake myself up. The bathroom was old, the kind that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The lights buzzed softly above me, casting a dull, yellowish glow over the cracked tiles and stained sinks. I turned on the faucet, the water coming out in a weak, sporadic stream, and splashed my face. As I dried my hands on my jeans, I heard the door creak open behind me. I glanced in the mirror and saw a man standing in the doorway, his face partially hidden in the shadows. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't say anything, just stood there for a moment, staring at me. I gave him a nod, trying to seem casual, but inside, my heart was starting to race. Something about the way he just stood there, not moving, gave me a bad feeling. "Hey," I muttered as I stepped past him, making my way toward the exit. He didn't respond, just continued to watch me as I left. Outside, the air felt even colder, and the breeze had picked up. I could feel my skin prickling as I made my way back to the car. I tried to shake off the weird encounter, telling myself that the guy was probably just another tired traveler, maybe a trucker stopping for a break. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, that creeping feeling of unease stuck with me. I made it back to my car, but instead of getting in, I decided to grab a snack from the vending machine. Maybe some sugar would help keep me awake for the rest of the drive. I fished some change out of my pocket and pressed the button for a candy bar, the machine whirring softly as it dropped the snack into the tray. Just as I reached in to grab it, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I turned around, half expecting it to be the guy from the bathroom, but the parking lot was empty. The trucks were still parked at the far end, their engines rumbling quietly, but there was no one else in sight. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the footsteps. I glanced toward the restroom, but the man wasn't there anymore. The door was shut, and the dim light inside cast long, eerie shadows across the pavement. My skin prickled again. I decided I'd had enough. I didn't need coffee or a snack that badly. I just wanted to get back on the road and away from whatever was making me feel so uneasy. I turned to head back to my car, but as I reached for the door handle, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. The door was already unlocked. I was sure I had locked it when I got out. I always lock my car, especially when I'm at a rest stop at night. My hand froze on the handle, my mind racing. Had I forgotten to lock it? Or had someone unlocked it while I was in the restroom? I hesitated for a moment, then cautiously opened the door, peeking inside. Everything looked normal. Nothing out of place. No sign that anyone had been in there. But that didn't ease the knot of fear tightening in my chest. I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. The hum of the car brought me a small sense of relief. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man from the bathroom standing in the shadows, watching me drive away. But the rest stop was empty. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was late. I was tired, and the mind plays tricks when you're alone in a quiet place like that. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me like a cold sweat. I got back on the highway, and for a while I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. The road stretched on, the darkness swallowing everything beyond the reach of my headlights. The hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires on the asphalt should have been comforting, but instead they felt oppressive, like I was the only person left in the world. And then, I noticed it. A light flickering in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just a car approaching from behind, but the light wasn't steady. It flickered, pulsing in and out like it was struggling to stay lit. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing behind me, just the empty stretch of highway. I checked the mirror again, and the light was still there, faint but unmistakable, flickering like a dying bulb. My heart started to race again. What the hell was that? I hadn't seen any other cars since I'd left the rest stop. How could there be lights behind me now? I pressed the gas pedal a little harder, speeding up, hoping to put some distance between me and whatever was behind me. But the light stayed with me, hovering in the rearview mirror like a ghost, always just out of reach. My palms were sweating, my grip on the steering wheel tightening as I tried to focus on the road ahead, but I couldn't stop glancing at the mirror, that flickering light taunting me, growing brighter and more erratic with every passing second. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. I blinked, my heart still racing, but when I checked the mirror again, the road behind me was empty. No flickering light, no cars, nothing. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it had just been a reflection, some trick of the light. But as much as I wanted to believe that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been following me, watching me. The rest of the drive was a blur. I didn't stop again, didn't slow down. I just kept my foot on the gas and my eyes on the road, refusing to look in the mirror again. By the time I finally reached my destination, the sun was starting to rise, casting a warm, golden light over the landscape. But even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the memory of that flickering light in my rearview mirror, or the man standing in the doorway of the restroom, watching me with those cold, empty eyes. It's been a few years since that night, but I still think about it every time I pull into a rest stop late at night. There's something about those places, something unsettling that I can't quite explain. And now, whenever I park at one, I always make sure to check the locks. Because sometimes, the things that make us uneasy in the night aren't just in our heads. Sometimes, they're real. There's something about camping that makes you feel both connected and vulnerable at the same time. Out there in the woods, far from the comforts of home, you're surrounded by nature, yet exposed to the elements, and, occasionally, to things you don't understand. I've camped plenty of times, but there's one night that stands out. The night I realized that sometimes, it's not the animals or the weather you need to worry about. It was a late summer weekend, and I'd decided to go camping solo, a way to clear my head after a stressful couple of weeks at work. I found a spot in a remote part of a state park that I'd never been to before. The area was perfect, completely isolated, with no one around for miles. It was the kind of place where you could forget about the rest of the world for a while. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground, but there was still plenty of light left to set up camp. I pitched my tent in a small clearing next to a river, the water gently flowing just a few feet away. It was peaceful, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. As the sun set and darkness settled in, I lit a small fire, made myself some dinner, and settled into the rhythm of the woods. The sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves in the breeze created a peaceful backdrop. I sat there, enjoying the crackling of the fire, the warmth on my face, and the stars beginning to appear above me. By the time the fire started to die down, it was late. The woods were completely dark now, the kind of darkness that only exists far away from the city. The moonlight barely filtered through the thick canopy of trees, and the only light was the faint glow from the embers of the fire. That's when I first noticed it. a strange movement just outside the glow of the fire. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, adjusting to the darkness. I blinked, focusing on the spot, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, curious about the fire. I wasn't too worried. I'd seen animals plenty of times while camping. They usually stayed at a distance, more afraid of me than I was of them. But then I saw it again, this time closer. A shadow, moving just beyond the edge of the firelight, almost blending into the darkness. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, too tall to be any kind of creature that would be wandering around the woods. It looked like the figure of a person, standing still, watching. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the spot where I'd seen the shadow. The fire was dying down now, casting flickering, uneven light across the campsite, and the shadows seemed to dance and shift with every crackle of the flames. I stood up, trying to get a better look. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. No response. Just the sound of the river and the crackling of the fire. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the trees where I'd seen the figure. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I swept the light back and forth, but the woods were empty. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the sudden wave of unease that had settled over me. I was alone out here in the middle of nowhere. No one else was supposed to be around. Maybe it had just been a trick of the light, or my tired mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I sat back down by the fire, stoking the embers to bring the flames back to life. The light flared up, casting long shadows across the ground, but I kept my flashlight close, my eyes darting to the edge of the clearing every few seconds. That's when I saw it again, clearer this time. The figure was standing just outside the light, barely visible among the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and thin. Its outline was dark, almost like it was made of shadow itself, and it didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. My heart raced, and my hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight. I shone the beam toward the figure, but the moment the light hit it, it vanished. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, like it had never been there at all. I stood up again, my skin prickling with fear. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I scanned the trees, but there was no sign of the figure. The only sound was the river and the soft crackling of the fire. I was alone, or at least, I thought I was. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me after a long day. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching from the darkness. I threw more wood on the fire, trying to keep it burning bright, and decided to stay up a little longer just in case. The flames flickered and danced, casting light across the clearing, but every time I looked toward the edge of the trees, I half expected to see that shadowy figure standing there again. It didn't take long before I started to hear noises, soft rustling sounds coming from the trees, like something was moving just out of sight. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the longer I listened, the more distinct the sounds became. Footsteps, steps, slow, deliberate footsteps circling the campsite. I grabbed the flashlight again, my heart pounding in my chest, and shone it toward the trees. The footsteps stopped, and the woods fell silent. I couldn't see anything beyond the beam of the light, just the dark shapes of trees swaying in the night air. For what felt like hours, I sat there, flashlight in hand, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the footsteps never came again, and the figure didn't reappear. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I knew I had to get some sleep if I was going to make it through the rest of the night. Reluctantly, I doused the fire, grabbed my flashlight, and retreated into the safety of my tent. The small space felt like a fortress, a thin barrier between me and whatever might be out there in the woods. I lay there for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart race, but nothing happened. No more footsteps, No more shadows, just the stillness of the night. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, the first light of dawn was filtering through the tent. The woods were quiet, peaceful even, as if nothing strange had happened the night before. I packed up my camp in record time, eager to get out of there. As I loaded my gear into the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me all night. I glanced back at the clearing one last time, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing among the trees, but there was nothing. Just the empty campsite and the soft sound of the river flowing nearby. As I drove away, I kept replaying the events of the night in my head, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by exhaustion and the eerie isolation of the woods. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I haven't been back to that campsite since. In fact, I haven't gone camping alone again at all. There's something out there in those woods, something that waits in the shadows, watching, waiting. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to find out. But I do know one thing: the woods aren't always as empty as they seem. There's an unspoken rule in camping. Once the fire dies down and the stars are out, the woods start to change. The trees seem to close in, and every little sound feels amplified in the stillness of the night. It's when the forest starts to breathe with you, and suddenly, you're aware of just how isolated you really are. I've always loved that feeling, until the night one of my friends disappeared without a trace. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. 5 of us, me, my girlfriend Amanda, my buddy Nick, his girlfriend Jess, and another friend Ryan, decided to get away from the city for a couple of days and reconnect with nature. We found a remote campsite deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, and figured it would be the perfect escape. No cell service, no distractions, just us, the trees, and a campfire. The first day was perfect. We hiked, swam in the nearby lake, and set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick pines. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we gathered around the fire, sharing stories and laughing about old times. The night was cool, the fire crackling in front of us, and everything felt just right. We were all in good spirits, far from the worries of daily life. As the evening wore on, the conversation slowed, and we found ourselves just enjoying the quiet. It was one of those moments where the only sounds were the occasional pop of the fire and the distant chirping of crickets. That peaceful, almost hypnotic kind of silence. That's when Ryan stood up, stretching his arms above his head. "Gonna head out for a bit," he said, his voice breaking the stillness. We all looked at him, a little confused. "Where are you going?" Nick asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just for a walk," Ryan replied with a shrug. "It's too nice of a night to sit here the whole time. I won't be long." None of us thought much of it. Ryan was always the type to wander off, especially when he needed time to think. He loved being in nature and had this habit of going on these solo hikes to clear his mind. We figured he'd be back in 20 minutes or so. "Don't get lost," Amanda called after him, laughing. Ryan just waved us off, disappearing into the woods with a flashlight in hand. The beam of light flickered between the trees for a few moments, then vanished completely as he went deeper into the forest. The rest of us stayed by the fire, chatting and joking around for a while longer. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to feel uneasy. Ryan had been gone for almost an hour, and the woods were getting darker, colder. It wasn't like him to wander off for so long without saying something. "Should we go check on him?" Jess asked, her voice hesitant. She was always the one who worried the most. Nick shook his head. "Nah, he's fine. You know Ryan. He's probably just enjoying the peace and quiet. He'll be back soon." But another half hour passed, and still no sign of Ryan. By then, even Nick was getting restless. "All right, I'll go see if I can find him," Nick said, standing up and grabbing a flashlight. "He can't have gone too far." "I'll come with you," I offered, my own unease growing. Something didn't feel right. We set off into the woods, calling Ryan's name as we went. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The air was cool and still, and the trees towered over us like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. "Ryan!" Nick called, his voice echoing through the woods, but there was no response, just the sound of our footsteps crunching over leaves and twigs. We walked for what felt like hours, the beam of our flashlights bouncing off tree trunks and casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. Every now and then, we'd stop and listen, hoping to hear Ryan's voice or the sound of his footsteps. But there was nothing, just silence. The farther we walked, the more I started to panic. Ryan wasn't the type to get lost. He was experienced in the outdoors, always aware of his surroundings. But there we were, in the middle of the woods, and there was no sign of him. "Maybe he went back to camp," Nick said, though his voice didn't sound confident. "We might have missed him." "Yeah," I agreed, though deep down, I didn't believe it. We turned back, heading in the direction of the campsite. The walk back felt even longer, the darkness closing in around us with every step. I kept expecting to see Ryan's flashlight flicker through the trees, or to hear his voice calling out to us, but the forest remained eerily quiet. When we finally made it back to camp, Amanda and Jess were waiting by the fire, their faces lit by the dim glow of the remaining embers. They stood up as we approached, their expressions tense. "Did you find him?" Amanda asked, her voice tight with worry. We shook our heads. "He wasn't out there," Nick said, his voice low. "No sign of him at all." Jess's face paled. Where could he have gone? That's when the fear really set in. Ryan wasn't the kind of person to just disappear. He wouldn't have wandered off without telling us, and he definitely wouldn't have been gone this long without checking in. Something was wrong. We decided to split up and search the surrounding area. Nick and Jess took one side of the clearing, while Amanda and I took the other. We called Ryan's name over and over, our voices growing hoarse as we pushed deeper into the woods. But no matter how far we went, there was no sign of him. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped, and the forest became colder, more unforgiving. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and sending chills down my spine. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound felt like it could be him, but it never was. Eventually, we regrouped at the campsite, exhausted and defeated. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting faint, flickering shadows across the clearing. "We have to go into town," Amanda said, her voice shaky. "We need help." None of us wanted to admit it, but she was right. Ryan wasn't coming back. We needed to find someone who could help us search, maybe even the park rangers. The idea of leaving him out there alone terrified me, but staying at the campsite, waiting in silence, was even worse. We packed up what little we could carry and set off for the nearest town, a 2-hour hike through the dark, winding trails. The walk was quiet, none of us speaking, just the sounds of our footsteps and the occasional crackle of leaves beneath our boots. Every now and then, I'd look back, half expecting to see Ryan jogging up the trail, laughing about how he had just gotten turned around. But it never happened. By the time we reached town and contacted the authorities, the sun was starting to rise. The park rangers organized a search party, combing the woods for any sign of Ryan. We retraced our steps, pointing out where we'd last seen him, where we had searched, but there was nothing. Days passed, and still, no sign of Ryan. It was like he had vanished into thin air, swallowed up by the woods. No footprints, no dropped items, no clues, just gone. The official report called it a disappearance under mysterious circumstances. But that phrase didn't even begin to cover what we felt. None of us could make sense of it. One minute, he was there, standing by the fire, joking around with us, and the next, he was gone. We talked about it endlessly in the weeks that followed, trying to figure out what had happened. Could he have gotten lost, fallen somewhere? But no matter how much we went over it, the truth was, we didn't know. And we probably never would. I've been camping since then, but it's never the same. The woods don't feel peaceful anymore. They feel different, like something's watching, waiting. I don't know what took Ryan, and maybe I don't want to know. But I'll never forget the way those trees seemed to close in on us that night. How the forest felt like it was holding its breath, like it knew something we didn't, and maybe it still does. There's something about road trips that makes you feel like you're untouchable. Miles of open road stretching out ahead, the freedom of no fixed plans, the kind of adventure that promises nothing but the unknown. I've always loved that feeling, the sense that anything could happen, good or bad, and the thrill of not knowing which one it would be. But this trip, this one crossed the line between adventure and something else, something I still can't explain. It was me and my friend Dylan, two guys just looking for a change of scenery. We'd planned this road trip for weeks, a cross-country drive, stopping wherever we felt like it, no set schedule, no deadlines, just us, the car, and whatever came our way. It was supposed to be fun, spontaneous, but somewhere along the way, things took a turn for the strange. We were driving through the middle of nowhere, one of those endless stretches of highway where there's nothing but flat land and a few scattered trees as far as the eye can see. The kind of place where you lose cell signal and feel completely cut off from the rest of the world. It was getting late, the sky starting to turn a deep purple as the sun dipped below the horizon, and we hadn't seen another car in miles. I was behind the wheel, my eyes starting to blur from hours of driving. Dylan was scrolling through the GPS, trying to find the next town or rest stop so we could fuel up and stretch our legs. "Anything coming up?" I asked, glancing over at him. He frowned at the screen. "Nothing for another 50 miles, but there's a gas station about 5 miles off the main road. It's a little out of the way, but we could stop there." I shrugged. "Sounds good. We need gas anyway." We took the next exit, following the narrow, winding road through fields and patches of trees. The further we drove, the darker it got, and the more isolated I felt. There were no streetlights, no signs of civilization, just the beam of our headlights cutting through the night. The road was rough, too, full of cracks and potholes, like it hadn't been maintained in years. After about 10 minutes, we finally saw it. An old, run-down gas station sitting by the side of the road, its neon sign flickering dimly in the dark. The building looked ancient, like it had been forgotten by time. The paint was peeling off the walls, the windows were covered in grime, and the lights above the pumps flickered weakly. There was only one car in the lot, an old, rusted sedan parked near the entrance. "I'm not getting great vibes from this place," Dylan muttered, glancing around. "Yeah, it's not exactly a 5-star spot," I agreed, but we didn't have much choice. We needed gas, and there wasn't another station for miles. I pulled up to the pump and killed the engine. The air outside was still and cold, the kind of cold that seemed to seep right into your bones, despite it being summer. I told Dylan I'd fill up the tank while he grabbed some snacks from inside. As I started pumping the gas, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced around, but there was no one outside, just the dark road and the flickering lights of the gas station. The only sound was the low hum of the pump as it dispensed fuel. After a minute, I heard the bell above the gas station's door jingle as Dylan stepped inside. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the weird feeling in the pit of my stomach, but it only seemed to get worse. I glanced over at the rusted sedan parked near the entrance, half expecting to see someone sitting inside, but the car was empty. Its windows were fogged up, and it looked like it hadn't moved in years. When the tank was full, I replaced the nozzle and looked toward the gas station. Dylan still hadn't come out. I frowned, wondering what was taking him so long. Maybe he was just browsing, but something about this place made me uneasy. I decided to head inside and check on him. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt it, an odd, heavy sensation in the air. Like the room was too quiet, too still. The inside of the gas station was dimly lit, with rows of dusty shelves lined with old, expired products. The air smelled musty, and the floor creaked beneath my feet as I walked. "Dylan," I called, my voice sounding louder than I expected in the silence. No answer. I walked past the shelves, scanning the aisles for any sign of him. The place wasn't big, but it felt oddly disorienting, like the layout didn't make sense. Shelves were haphazardly placed, and some of the products looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The whole place felt wrong. I made my way to the back of the store, where a small counter stood beneath a buzzing fluorescent light. An old man sat behind the counter, hunched over with his head down. His skin was pale and wrinkled, and he wore a faded flannel shirt that looked about as old as the building itself. He didn't acknowledge me as I approached. "Hey, did you see my friend come in here?" I asked. The man didn't respond. He didn't even look up. I took a step closer. "Hello. My friend was just in here. Did you see him?" The old man slowly raised his head, and when his eyes met mine, I felt a jolt of cold fear run through me. His eyes were glassy, vacant, like he wasn't really seeing me. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. I took a step back, my heart racing. Something was very wrong. I turned and hurried back down the aisle, calling for Dylan again, but the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the corner. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. Where was he? I rushed toward the door, ready to check outside, when I heard a soft creak behind me. I spun around and saw a figure emerging from the back of the store, stepping out from behind one of the shelves. It was Dylan, but something was off. He was moving slowly, almost mechanically, and his expression was blank, like he wasn't fully there. His eyes, usually bright and full of life, were dull, unfocused. "Dylan," I said, taking a cautious step toward him. He didn't respond, just kept walking toward the door, his movement stiff and unnatural. My stomach twisted as I watched him, fear bubbling up inside me. "Dylan, what's going on? Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaky. He still didn't answer. He just walked past me, out the door, and into the night. I followed him outside, my heart pounding in my chest. He was heading straight for the car, not saying a word, not looking back. I grabbed his arm as he reached the driver's side door. "Hey, talk to me. What's going on?" For a moment, he stopped, and I thought he was going to answer. But then, without a word, he pulled his arm free, got into the car, and shut the door. I stood there, staring at him through the window, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His face was pale, his eyes still vacant, like he was in some kind of trance. I didn't know what to do. Everything inside me screamed that we needed to get out of there, that something wasn't right. I got into the passenger seat, and before I could say anything, Dylan started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, his movements still slow and mechanical. We drove in silence for a long time. The road stretched out before us, dark and empty, with no other cars in sight. I kept glancing over at Dylan, but he just stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the wheel, his face expressionless. "Dylan, what happened back there?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer, just kept driving, his eyes locked on the road. I tried asking again, but it was like talking to a brick wall. He wasn't there, not really, and that terrified me more than anything. Eventually, I stopped trying to get through to him. I sat in silence, watching the miles slip by, wondering what had happened to my friend in that strange, run-down gas station, wondering if I'd ever get him back. We didn't stop again until we reached the next town, hours later. Dylan parked the car outside a motel, and without a word, he got out and headed for the room we'd booked earlier. I followed him inside, still shaken, still trying to make sense of what had happened. He fell asleep almost immediately, but I couldn't. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. I don't know what happened to Dylan that night. The next morning, he was back to normal, like nothing had happened. He didn't remember going into the gas station, didn't remember acting strange. It was like that part of the night had been erased from his mind. But I remember, and every time I think about that gas station, every time I see an old, flickering neon sign by the side of the road, I feel that same cold dread creeping up my spine. Because I know, deep down, that we never should have stopped there. I used to think picking up hitchhikers was one of those old-school, adventurous things people did back in the day. You know, when people trusted each other more and the world felt a little less dangerous. But after what happened to me on that quiet stretch of road a few years back, I don't stop for anyone anymore. I learned the hard way that not everything, or everyone, is what they seem. It was late October, and I was on a solo road trip, driving through the middle of nowhere. I had taken a detour off the highway to explore some scenic back roads, a long stretch of empty, winding road that cut through fields and forests. The kind of place where you might not see another car for miles. Perfect for clearing your head. Or so I thought. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a pale pink glow across the sky. I'd been driving for hours and was starting to feel the wear of the road in my bones. My destination was still a couple of hours away, but I wasn't in a rush. With my favorite playlist keeping me company, I figured I'd stop at the next town to stretch my legs, grab a bite, maybe find a cheap motel for the night. But then I saw him. He appeared out of nowhere, standing by the side of the road with his thumb out, a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. There was something about him that felt out of place, like he didn't belong there, in the middle of that long, deserted road. He wasn't the scruffy, disheveled type you'd expect to see hitchhiking. He was young, maybe mid-20s, with neat clothes, jeans and a plain t-shirt, and a calm, almost serene expression on his face. I slowed down as I approached, debating whether or not to pick him up. I wasn't usually the kind of person to stop for strangers, but something about him seemed safe, harmless even. I figured he was probably just some college kid who got stranded out here, trying to make his way to the next town. And besides, the road was empty. There wasn't a gas station or bus stop for miles. It felt wrong to leave him out there alone as the night crept in. I pulled over and rolled down the passenger window. "Hey, where you headed?" I called out. He stepped closer, a small, grateful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Just trying to get to the next town," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "It's a ways off, and I've been walking for a while." There was something soft about the way he spoke, polite, respectful. I figured I could trust him, at least for a short ride. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. "Hop in." He slid into the passenger seat, setting his duffel bag carefully at his feet. I glanced at him as I pulled back onto the road. He was quiet, his gaze fixed straight ahead, but there was nothing particularly strange about him. Just a guy, down on his luck, catching a ride. For the first few miles, we didn't talk much. The road stretched out ahead of us, long and dark, with only the occasional flicker of headlights in the distance. I kept glancing at him from the corner of my eye, trying to make small talk to break the awkward silence. "So, where are you from?" I asked. "Here and there," he replied, his voice soft, almost distracted. "I've been moving around a lot lately." I nodded, not wanting to pry. "I hear that. Life on the road can be pretty freeing." "Yeah," he said, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "But sometimes, it feels like you're running from something, or running to something. Depends on how you look at it, I guess." His words hung in the air, and I wasn't quite sure how to respond. There was a strange, heavy quality to the way he said it, like he wasn't just talking about traveling, like he meant something deeper. I didn't push it. Instead, I focused on the road, watching as the night deepened around us. The stars began to flicker into view, bright and clear against the dark sky. The road was empty, just us, the hum of the engine, and the steady rhythm of the tires on asphalt. We drove in silence for a while longer, the miles slipping by in the darkness. I could feel the weight of the long day catching up with me, my eyelids growing heavier with each passing minute. But then, out of nowhere, the hitchhiker spoke again, his voice cutting through the quiet. "Have you ever been lost?" he asked, his tone so calm it sent a chill down my spine. "Lost?" I echoed, glancing at him. He nodded, his gaze still distant. "You know, lost, like you don't know where you're going anymore. You're just drifting." I swallowed, unsure of how to answer. There was something unsettling about the way he said it, like he was talking about more than just getting lost on the road, like he was talking about something deeper, something darker. "Yeah," I finally said, my voice quiet. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes." He didn't respond. He just nodded, a faint, knowing smile tugging at his lips. The air in the car felt heavier now, thicker somehow, and I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease creeping over me. The road ahead curved sharply, and just as I was about to steer into the turn, the hitchhiker spoke again, his voice low and firm. "Turn left here." I frowned, glancing at the GPS on my dashboard. There was no left turn. The map showed a straight road for miles. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my grip tightening on the wheel. "Left," he repeated, his voice harder now, more insistent. "Turn left." I glanced at him, my pulse quickening. His expression had changed, his once calm demeanor now replaced by something cold, something urgent. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I felt real fear creep into my chest. "I can't," I said, my voice trembling. "There's no road there." "Turn left," he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. Without thinking, I jerked the wheel to the right, pulling over to the side of the road. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking. "Get out of the car." The hitchhiker didn't move. He just stared at me, his eyes cold and unblinking. I said, "Get out," I shouted, fumbling for the door handle. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tension broke. The hitchhiker blinked, his expression softening. He nodded, slowly, and without another word, he opened the door and stepped out onto the side of the road. I watched him in the rearview mirror as he stood there, still as a statue, his figure slowly fading into the darkness as I pulled back onto the road. My hands were trembling as I gripped the wheel, my mind racing with questions. What had just happened? Why had he wanted me to turn off the road? And what was he running from? The next town came into view a half hour later, and I pulled into the first gas station I saw, needing to collect myself. My head was spinning, my body still trembling with the remnants of fear. I parked the car and sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. But when I looked over at the passenger seat, I froze. The duffel bag, the hitchhiker had left it behind. My heart pounded as I reached for it, my hands shaking. I unzipped the bag, expecting to find clothes, maybe some food. But what I found instead made my blood run cold. Inside was a single, folded piece of paper. I unfolded it slowly, my hands trembling. Scrawled in messy handwriting were 2 words: "Thank you." That was it. No explanation, no reason, just those 2 words. I shoved the bag away, my heart racing. I couldn't explain what had happened on that road, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I never saw the hitchhiker again, and to this day, I have no idea who or what he really was. All I know is that after that night, I stopped picking up strangers, because sometimes, when you help someone on the road, you might not be helping a person at all. It's strange how quickly a routine drive can turn into something you can't forget. I've always been the kind of person who finds comfort in the familiarity of the road. Driving at night with nothing but the hum of the engine and the soft glow of streetlights. It's peaceful, meditative even. I never expected one of those quiet, uneventful drives to leave me with a memory that still makes my skin crawl. It was a late Thursday night, and I was driving home from work after pulling a double shift. My usual route was a stretch of highway that wound through rural farmland, long and mostly empty. It wasn't the kind of road you'd see much traffic on, especially after dark. Just endless miles of open road, flanked by fields and the occasional cluster of trees. I'd driven it 1,000 times before without a second thought. The night was clear, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft silver light over the landscape. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead, while the soft murmur of the radio kept me company. It was just after midnight, and I was tired, but not enough to worry about nodding off. I figured I'd be home in about an hour, showered, and in bed soon enough. But then I noticed something strange in my rearview mirror. At first, it was nothing, just a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I glanced up, but there was nothing there, just the empty road stretching out behind me. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I was just seeing things. It had been a long day, after all. But then I saw it again. A figure sitting in the back seat. I did a double take, my heart skipping a beat. The car was empty. There was no one in the back seat. I knew that. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror again, there it was, a shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light, sitting perfectly still in the back seat. My chest tightened as panic washed over me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my eyes darting between the road and the mirror. I couldn't make out any details, just a vague silhouette, like a person slouched in the seat behind me. But every time I looked away, my mind raced with possibilities. Was someone in the car with me? Had they been there the whole time? I glanced back again, expecting to see nothing, but the figure was still there, unmoving, just barely visible in the mirror. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to focus on the road, but my mind was spinning. There was no way anyone could have gotten into my car. I had locked the doors the moment I got in, and I hadn't stopped for anything. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from the window or something I'd left in the back seat. But the more I stared at the mirror, the clearer the figure became. It wasn't just my imagination. Someone or something was back there. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling on the wheel. I didn't know what to do. Should I pull over? Stop and check. But the thought of pulling over on that dark, deserted highway in the middle of the night made my skin crawl. What if I stopped and found something back there? I kept driving, my heart racing, my mind spinning with fear. I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror. Every time I looked, the figure seemed a little more defined, a little more real. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a person, or at least, it looked like one. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to try something. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, making sure the figure was still there, and then I turned around in my seat. Empty. The back seat was completely empty. No one was there. Just my crumpled jacket, lying on the seat where I'd tossed it earlier. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me. I was just tired. That's all it was. My mind was playing tricks on me after a long day. I laughed softly to myself, feeling foolish for getting so worked up. Of course, there was no one in the car with me. I'd been imagining things. But then I looked back at the mirror. The figure was still there. My stomach dropped, and a cold wave of fear washed over me. I hadn't imagined it. The figure was real, or at least it was real in the mirror. But when I turned around, the back seat was empty. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to explain it. All I knew was that I needed to get home, fast. I pressed my foot down on the gas, speeding up as the highway stretched out before me. The road blurred in my vision as I kept my eyes glued to the mirror, watching the figure sitting silently in the back seat. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just sat there, still as a statue, like it was waiting for something. My heart raced as I tried to focus on the road, but the fear was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that whatever was in the mirror was real, that it was watching me, waiting for the right moment. The miles flew by in a blur, the dark shapes of trees and fields rushing past me on either side. I didn't slow down, didn't stop. I just drove, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. Finally, I saw the turnoff for my neighborhood up ahead. I barely slowed down as I took the exit, my tires squealing against the asphalt. I was almost home, just a few more minutes, and I'd be safe. But the figure was still there. As I pulled onto my street, my hands trembling, I made a decision. I wasn't going to stay in that car any longer than I had to. The moment I parked in my driveway, I was going to get out, lock the doors, and run into the house. I didn't care if it seemed paranoid. I just needed to be out of that car. I pulled into my driveway, threw the car into park, and jumped out, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding, and my breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled for my keys, my eyes darting between the car and the front door. I ran inside, locking the door behind me. The house was dark and silent, but the familiar comfort of home didn't bring me the relief I expected. My mind was still racing, my heart still pounding in my chest. I paced the living room, trying to calm myself down, but the image of the figure in the rearview mirror was burned into my mind. Eventually, I forced myself to sit down, taking deep breaths to steady myself. It was over. I was home, safe. There was no one in the car, no one following me. I had just imagined the whole thing. That's what I kept telling myself over and over again, trying to convince myself it was true. But even as I sat there in the dark, the image of the figure wouldn't leave me. It had been so clear, so real. And no matter how many times I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't drive the car again for a few days. I made excuses, telling myself I needed a break from the road, that I was too tired, too stressed. But the truth was, I was afraid of what I might see in the rearview mirror if I got back behind the wheel. When I finally did drive again, it was broad daylight, and I made sure I wasn't alone. But every time I glanced in the mirror, my heart skipped a beat, half expecting to see that figure sitting silently in the back seat, watching me. It's been months since that night, and I still don't know what I saw. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after a long day. Maybe it was a reflection, a trick of the light. But every time I get in the car, every time I glance in the rearview mirror, I can't help but feel that same unease creeping up my spine. Because once you've seen something like that, it's hard to forget. And no matter how hard I try to convince myself otherwise, part of me still believes that figure is out there, waiting for the right moment to return.